In the middle of the 1930s, the Gulag population swelled to huge proportions as the victims of collectivization and the famine were rounded up and sent to labor camps, now considered an integral component of the Soviet industrial economy. Between 1932 and 1936, the population of the labor camps, labor colonies, and special settlements reached 2.4 million people. The prison population would add another 500,000. This slave labor force played an especially vital role in the timber, construction, and mining industries in the remote regions of the Arctic North, where free labor would not go. Consequently, even inside the Gulag, it was possible for people to advance their careers. Opportunities were available not only to prison guards and administrators, whose service in the Gulag often brought promotion in the NKVD, but also to a select number of prisoners, provided they had skills required by the Gulag system and the commitment or willingness to adapt to the party line. Pavel Wittenberg, the geologist who had played such a leading role in the Soviet exploration of mining areas in the Arctic zone, was arrested in April 1930. He was one of several hundred scientists expelled in a purge of the Academy of Sciences. Imprisoned in Leningrad, he was gradually broken down by interrogations and by threats against his family, until he finally confessed to belonging to a monarchist organization that had helped to organize the Yakutsk Rebellion in 1927, when Wittenberg had been involved in the exploration of the Kolyma goldfields in northeast Siberia. The breaking point had come when his interrogator had got up in his presence and made a call to order the arrest of Pavel's wife, Zinaida. When Pavel was in jail, Zina lived in constant expectation of arrest. The family was forced to move into one room of their spacious country house in Olgino, while an Ogpu informer occupied the other rooms and organized the confiscation of their property. Pavel's daughter Yevgenia recalls accompanying her mother on weekly trips to Leningrad to inquire about Pavel at the Ogpu offices on Gorokhovaya Street. She would leave me, an 8-year-old girl, by the fountains, which were not working then, in the Admiralty Gardens, telling me that I should wait for her return. If she did not come, it would mean that she had been arrested, and I was to go to an address she had written on a piece of paper, which I kept in my pocket. Tatiana Lvovna lived there, and she would take me in. In February 1931, Pavel was sentenced to be shot. At the last moment he was given a reprieve and sentenced to 10 years in a labor camp instead. His house at Olgino was confiscated. It became the dacha of an Ogpu official. Pavel was sent to the Mai Guba logging camp to fell timber for the White Sea Canal, and then transferred as a sewage engineer to the labor camp near Kem, on the northern sector of the canal where it ran into the sea. Zina, meanwhile, moved with 2 of her daughters, Yevgenia and Valentina, into a single room in a communal apartment in Leningrad. Her eldest daughter, Veronika, had moved to Dagestan. There were 16 people living in the communal apartment, including its original owners, an elderly couple who occupied the front room, and their former servant, a woman full of class hatred, who lived behind a curtain in the corridor. During the summer, Zina sent her 2 daughters to stay with relatives in Kiev, while she worked as a volunteer doctor in the labor camp at Kem, so as to be close to her husband. Shortly after Zina's return to Leningrad in August 1931, Pavel was sent as a geologist to the island of Vaygach as part of a special Ogpu expedition to explore the possibility of mining its precious minerals. Pavel was lucky. He was saved by his expertise as a geologist. Although still a prisoner, he was allowed to work in his own field and demonstrated his talents in the service of the Gulag. The Vaygach expedition was led by Fyodor Eichmanns, the Ogpu head of the whole Gulag, who left his post in Moscow to set up the first camp on the remote Arctic island in the Kara Sea in June 1930. Nearly half of the 1,500 prisoners were geologists, topographers, and engineers who surveyed the island's rich deposits of zinc and lead and searched, in vain, for gold and platinum, Eichmann's real reasons for getting involved in the project. The Nenets people, Samoyeds, who lived on the island and provided transport for the expedition, told of ancient legends about the Golden Woman, a totem doll of solid gold. Conditions in the camp were very difficult, especially in the first months before the barracks had been built, when everybody had to live in tents. The zinc and lead mines were all dug by hand. Discipline was harsh. People were shot for the slightest infraction, and many died from the extreme cold, which regularly reached temperatures of -40 degrees centigrade during the winter. By the time Wittenberg arrived, the hunt for gold had become desperate, which probably explains why he was called up to reinforce the number of geologists already there. Pavel was quickly made the chief geologist. He completed the survey of Vajgač, which led to the opening of the Gulag mining complex, the first mines within the Arctic Circle, in 1934. He published several articles about the expedition in Ogpu periodicals, and even kept a scrapbook on the island's natural history. For a prisoner, Pavel enjoyed a privileged existence. He received special rations, lived in a separate house for specialists, and even had his own office. In March 1932, he was allowed a visit by his family, who returned in the summer to accompany him on a major expedition around Vajgač. Leaving Valentina with a friend in Leningrad, Zina came with Yevgenia to live with Pavel in the summer of 1933, when the new commander of the camp, Alexei Dizklan, who replaced Eichmanns in October 1932, allowed specialists to be joined by their families. Her letters home describe the conditions. Vajgač Island, 26th of August, 1933. My dear little daughters, Veronichka and Lyusenka. Valentina. Late in the evening on the 24th, we finally arrived at Papa's. It took 6 days, 3 of them in cold force 5 winds, to get here. Gulenka, Yevgenia, was very brave, considering that most of the passengers around us were seasick all the time. Papochka met us on the ship, loaded everything onto his motorboat, and by 11 o'clock we were home. Papochka looks very well. He has put on weight. His face is an excellent colour without a single wrinkle. His mood is good, he is full of energy, and, as always, he is happy in his work. We are living very well in a house for specialists, remarkably, in fact, if you stop to think that this is the 70th parallel. We have 2 delightful rooms, each with 3 windows, so they are very light, even though they face towards the northeast and northwest. There is an enormous stove with an oven, so I shall have to improve my housekeeping skills, which I have completely lost. I shall send you a photograph of Papa with the next ship, and you will see for yourselves how good it is here and how much weight Papa has put on. Yesterday evening we were at a reception to bid farewell to those prisoners returning to the mainland and to welcome the new arrivals. We liked the speeches very much, and the heroes of labour were very well received. The Vajgač expedition, it appears, came in first in the all-union socialist competition. There is a wonderful reforging, perikovka, of people happening here. All the prisoners return to the mainland as qualified, literate and conscious workers. If only we could reforge more like that. The evening ended with a living newspaper, a form of agitprop, and an excellent concert. That's all my news from the first 1.5 days. Gradually, within the confines of the labour camp, the Wittenbergs returned to the routines of family life. Zina worked as a doctor in the camp clinic. Yevgenia attended the school for children of the specialists and administrators. Our life revolved around the work of Mama and Papa, recalls Yevgenia. Every morning, in whatever temperature, Papa filled a pan with cold water and washed himself in our room, ate some breakfast, and then went to work in the geological section. When he returned, we would eat our dinner, and then he would sit down at his desk. Mamma was always tired from her work. In the evening she had barely strength to read. I did all the housework after school because I had the most time. I fetched our dinners, 2 for voluntary workers and 1 for a prisoner, from the canteen. The cooks were all Chinese. They were excellent. They taught me how to bake. In general, the food seemed royal to us compared with what we had in Leningrad. What lies behind this rosy view of the Gulag? According to Yevgenia, Zina's optimism, even her belief in Perikovka, was genuinely held, not just written in her letters for the benefit of the censors. No doubt the happiness of being reunited as a family must have played a part, but equally important were the relatively privileged conditions of specialists like the Wittenbergs, which sheltered them from the worst aspects of life inside the camp. Possibly, too, they were so wrapped up in their work that they willingly accepted any view that allowed them to continue with it and sleep easily at night. In 1934, there was a revolt on the island of Vaigach. A gang of prisoners working on the far side of the island rebelled and killed their guards. There was nowhere for the rebels to escape, and eventually they were shot or captured and brought back to the camp. As one of the camp doctors, Zina had to inspect their wounds and decide which prisoners were fit to return to work. She saw evidence of terrible beatings, but nothing shook her faith in Perikovka, nor her readiness, as she had agreed in her contract of employment, to enforce the camp's regime of labor discipline by reducing the time spent by prisoners on sick leave. For her work in the aftermath of the uprising, Zina was rewarded with the honorable title of shock worker, Udarnitsa, and listed in the Red Book of the camp. She helped to teach the prisoners to read and to learn a craft in the belief that this would help reforge their personality and rehabilitate them to society. She even joined the party school and wrote to tell her daughters that she loved her studies there. Pavel was equally prepared to go along with the official view of the Gulag, according to Yevgenia. In her view, he lived entirely for his science and took little interest in politics. He was grateful to the Soviet regime for giving him the opportunity to continue working in his field, and grateful, too, that his family had been allowed to join him at Vaigach. If he believed the propaganda about Perikovka, it was because, according to his daughter, he was sincere, naive perhaps, and romantic by nature. Much of this is perhaps true, but it is the viewpoint of a loving daughter who cherishes the memory of her father. Seen from a different perspective, Pavel's actions could be described as a profound moral compromise. His work was clearly flourishing in the environment of the labor camp, where everything he needed was provided for. "How pleasant to be a commander at Vaigach," Pavel wrote in his diary. "There is a semi-military discipline and complete obedience among the workers here." In July 1935, Pavel was given early release, 6 years before the end of his sentence, in recognition of his valuable work, but he wanted to complete his geological research on Vaigach, so he signed a contract with the administration to continue working voluntarily. This, it seems, was a crucial turning point, the moment when he ceased to be a prisoner working for the Gulag by compulsion and became a collaborator in the Gulag system to advance his own research. After finishing his work on Vaigach, Pavel went to the Dmitrov labor camp, where he was employed as a geologist in the construction of the Moscow-Volga Canal. Meanwhile, Zina and Yevgenia, having returned to Leningrad, found that life became more comfortable. They went back to the communal apartment where they had lived before, and Valentina and Veronika joined them. They soon received an extra room after the old owners of the apartment were arrested in the Leningrad terror following the murder of Kirov. Because they were not allowed to recover their old furniture from Olgino, which was still used as a dacha by the NKVD, the Wittenbergs were invited to the NKVD warehouse and allowed to help themselves to furniture confiscated from the victims of the Leningrad arrests. Valentina and Veronica picked out a pair of antique armchairs, a divan, a mirror, a bookcase, and a grand piano. Pavel returned to Leningrad in 1936. For the next 2 years he worked for the Gulag administration of the Arctic Ocean, leading several expeditions to Severnaya Zemlya. How to get more living space so that we can live together comfortably as one united, close-knit family. That is the task I cannot seem to solve, Pavel wrote to Yevgenia in 1936. Although he had managed to secure a privileged position through his work in the Gulag, he still felt insecure politically, and he was worried about his family. "It is hard to accept that I am so powerless to arrange a comfortable life for all of you, as you deserve after all your suffering with me. The one thing I could do is build a little house, but Mama will not hear of it. Powerful people who might help me have turned their backs on me. When will I regain even a tenth of the influence I had before 1930? Pavel made a conscious effort to Sovietize himself. He took lessons in the party's history and embraced the truth that it taught him. By the end of 1936, he was ready to accept its teachings on the Trotskyists and other enemies of the Soviet regime. "What a shame that I never knew anything about this," Pavel wrote in his diary. "If only I had known how reading history broadens the horizon and enables one to reach a proper understanding of the party's general line. Maybe my life would not have been forced onto the stony path of exile and imprisonment. For what was my life destroyed? That bastard Trotsky is to blame for thousands of lost lives." Pavel's story reminds us that the Gulag was far more than a prison camp. As one of the driving forces of the Soviet industrial economy, it employed a vast army of specialists and technicians, engineers, geologists, architects, research scientists, even aircraft designers, and gave them unique opportunities to develop their careers. Pavel Drozdov was born in 1906 to a peasant family in Chernigov. His father was actively involved in the Marxist movement before 1917. After both his parents were killed in the Civil War, Pavel went to Moscow, joined the economics faculty of Moscow University, and then trained as an electrician. He later worked for Moscow Energy, the power station responsible for the electrification of much of the capital. In 1925, Pavel was arrested for his participation in a student organization at Moscow University. He was exiled for 3 years to the Krasnovyshchersk region, where he worked in a logging camp attached to Vishlag, then still in its early days. On his release in 1927, a year before the end of his sentence, Pavel chose to remain at the camp, where he was employed as an accountant. He married Alexandra, a young peasant girl from a village near the camp, and had 2 children who lived with him in the hostel for administrators in the camp complex. In 1929, when Eduard Berzin, the enlightened Gulag chief, arrived at Vishlag, Pavel's fortunes changed dramatically. Berzin championed the reforging of prisoners, and in Drozdov he believed that he had found a living example of his ideal. Berzin recognized the talents of Pavel, in particular his photographic memory. Berzin liked to say that Pavel had a built-in calculator in his head. He rapidly promoted Pavel in the camp administration, and often drew attention to the former prisoner as an example of reforging in his talks to senior officials at Vishlag. In 1929, Pavel was appointed chief accountant of the logging camp, and in 1930, chief accountant of the entire Vishlag complex. As one of Berzin's close associates, Pavel followed Berzin when he left Vishlag to organize the Dalstroy network of labor camps in northeast Siberia. In Magadan, the capital of this Gulag empire, Pavel became the chief accountant in the planning section of the Dalstroy Trust and an inspector of the Dalstroy labor camps. Promoted to the rank of lieutenant general in the NKVD, Pavel was rewarded with a 4-room flat, which was big enough to house not just his family, but the family of his sister, too. He was also given an apartment in Moscow, where Alexandra and the children would spend the winter months. The family lived a privileged existence, with access to the special shops and sanatoria exclusively reserved for the Stalinist elite, and manufactured gifts from the Dalstroy factories on the Soviet holidays. Not bad for a man who only a few years before had been a common prisoner in the Gulag. Mikhail Stroikov was born in 1901 to a family of old believers near Ivanovo, 300 kilometers northeast of Moscow. In 1925, he enrolled as a student at the Moscow Architectural Institute and married Yelena, a young artist at a Rabfak school, which prepared students from working-class backgrounds to study at an institute. Their daughter, Yulia, was born in 1927. Just before her birth, Mikhail was arrested and exiled to Siberia. He had belonged to a student group opposed to the agrarian policies of the Bolsheviks. Yelena was expelled from the Rabfak school and went to work in a textile factory. In 1930, Mikhail returned to Moscow and rejoined the Architectural Institute, but 2 years later he was rearrested and imprisoned for 2 years in the Butyrki jail. Mikhail was considered a brilliant student. He had not been able to complete his dissertation before his arrest, but thanks to the intervention of his professor, he was allowed to do so in the Butyrki, and even to defend it at the institute. It is inconceivable that Mikhail could have done this without the support of the political police. He had 2 uncles in Ogpu, and one of his oldest friends was Philippe Bazanov, Elena's first husband, who was also a senior official in Ogpu. Bazanov helped Elena and tried to persuade her to return to him while Mikhail was in jail. In 1934, Mikhail was exiled to Arkhangelsk. Although he had relatives in Arkhangelsk, among them the family of the former vice-governor of Murmansk, Mikhail did not visit them because he did not want to endanger them. Mikhail was saved by his architectural expertise. He was employed by the NKVD as a planner architect on several major building projects, factories and bridges, using Gulag labor from the nearby camps. He soon became one of the chief architects of Arkhangelsk. Even as a prisoner in exile, Mikhail enjoyed better living conditions than Yelena and Yulia in Moscow. Mikhail was earning good money. He ate in the NKVD cafeteria for engineers and technicians, where meat was served every day, whereas Yulia and Yelena were living in Moscow on a diet of porridge and bread. Mikhail sent them money to buy meat. Yulia was often ill and desperately needed better food. At the end of 1934, Yelena sent her to live with her father in Arkhangelsk, in the hope that she would benefit from Mikhail's relatively comfortable position. The last time Yulia had seen her father, the only recollection she had of him, was 2 years earlier in the Butyrki prison, a visit which had left her in such a state that, at the age of only 6, she had tried to commit suicide. Mikhail rented the corner of a room from an old woman, Yelena Petrovna, who prepared their meals. Yulia recalls these meals: pork cutlets with macaroni, pancakes with mincemeat, chicken legs, ice cream, with nostalgia. In the evenings when Papa returned from work, he would ask me, "What shall we order from Yelena Petrovna? What do you want to eat?" I couldn't get enough of her delicious food, and I would always say, the first dish she had cooked for us, "Macaroni and cutlets, macaroni and cutlets." One day Papa had enough. He implored me, "Lusenka, think of something else. I can't eat any more." But I could not think of any other food. For Yulia, the years she spent in Arkhangelsk from 1934 to 1937 were the happiest in her life. She thrived at school. She loved the ballet. Her father took her to the theatre and bought a gramophone so she could dance to ballet music in their tiny living space. Papa's corner, as Yelena called this living space, was just 7 square meters, with a plywood partition and door constructed by Mikhail to divide it from the rest of the room, where Yelena Petrovna lived. Mikhail was very proud of his construction, which created the illusion of a separate room. Papa's corner was just big enough for a single bed, a table, a chair, and a bookcase on the wall, but it was a home of sorts, and Yulia was happy to be living there with her father. In January 1937, Yelena came to Arkhangelsk. The end of Mikhail's sentence was approaching, and she wanted to return to Moscow as a family. But the authorities would not let her stay in Arkhangelsk until the end of Mikhail's exile, and so Yelena went back to Moscow with Yulia. A few weeks later, in March, Mikhail was arrested and sentenced to 5 years in a labor camp for counter-revolutionary agitation. He was shot in 1938. Yelena knew nothing about his arrest. There were no more letters from her husband. She only learned what had happened the next summer, when she went back to Arkhangelsk and spoke to Yelena Petrovna. The Wittenbergs, the Drozdovs, and the Stroikovs were exceptional, of course. The vast majority of the Gulag population was used as slave labor or left to languish in prison camps and remote settlements, with little access to the comforts of normal life or even prospect of reprieve. The cost in human lives was enormous. NKVD statistics show that over 150,000 people died in Soviet labor camps between 1932 and 1936. These figures cast a different light on the mid-1930s, a period which has often been regarded as the calm before the storm of 1937 to 8. The poet Anna Akhmatova called the middle 30s the vegetarian years. For those whose lives were devastated by the Great Terror, that view of the mid-30s may be true, but for millions of people whose families were scattered in the Gulag's labor camps and colonies, these years were as bad as any other. Reading the letters of these prisoners to their relatives at home, letters that were written with censorship in mind, it is striking how the Gulag changed the values and priorities of so many of these prisoners, particularly the politicals who had sacrificed so much for their ideals. Where before they might have looked for happiness in their career or in the promise of a communist utopia, years of living in a prison camp or exile forced them to rethink and place greater value on the family. Tatiana Polos, née Myagkova, was born in 1898 to the family of a barrister in the Borysoglebsk region of Tambov province. Her mother, Feoktista, the daughter of a priest, was a member of the Social Democratic Party who sided with the Bolsheviks when they split with the Mensheviks in 1903. She encouraged Tatiana to enter politics. In 1919, Tatiana joined the Bolshevik Party and took part in propaganda work behind the lines of Denikin's White Army on the Southern Front in the Civil War. It was there that she met her husband, Mikhail Polos, a leading member of the Borotbists, social revolutionaries, the only Ukrainian party with a mass peasant following, who at that time was serving in the military council of the Ukrainian independent government. At the end of the Civil War, the Borotbists merged with the Bolsheviks. The Ukraine was brought under Soviet rule, and Polos became the Ukraine's political representative, Polpred, in Moscow. Tatiana joined the higher party school, attending lectures by Trotsky. In 1923, Mikhail was named Commissar of Finance in the Soviet Ukrainian government. He and Tatiana settled in Kharkov, the capital of Soviet Ukraine, until 1934, where their daughter Rada was born in 1924. 3 years later, Tatiana was exiled to Astrakhan, and then, in 1929, to Chilka in Kazakhstan. She was accused of being an active oppositionist with links to the Smirnov Group, an important faction of the left opposition led by Trotsky until the expulsion of its leaders from the party in 1927. In the autumn of 1929, Mikhail visited Tatiana in Kazakhstan. He pleaded with her to renounce her opposition politics for the sake of their daughter, who was then living with her grandmother. At one point, according to a fellow oppositionist who was also exiled in Chilka, Mikhail whispered something in her ear. It was some sort of secret information that left her utterly despondent and defeated. Perhaps Mikhail had told her that Smirnov and his group had been negotiating a capitulation with the Stalinist authorities in the hope of being reinstated in the party. On the 3rd of November 1929, an article by Smirnov appeared in Pravda in which he declared his full support for the 5-year plan and the general line of the party, renounced his Trotskyist position, and called on all his followers to overcome their hesitations and return to the party. 400 members of the Smirnov group subsequently signed a declaration of submission to the party's general line, including Tatiana, who was then released from exile and allowed to return to her family. In 1930, the family moved from Kharkov to Moscow, where Poulos became deputy chairman of the All-Union Soviet Budget Commission, while Tatiana worked as an economist in the automobile industry. They lived with Tatiana's mother, Feoktista, and a housekeeper in a large apartment in the house on the Embankment, the prestigious block of flats for government workers opposite the Kremlin, although, as romantic revolutionaries who had always lived for their ideas, the family did not attach much importance to their privileged lifestyle. Tatiana kept to her Trotskyist position against the wishes of both her husband, who insisted that opposition to Stalin was futile, and her mother, who was a convinced Stalinist. In 1933, Tatiana was rearrested, along with the rest of the Smirnov group, and sentenced to 3 years in a special isolation prison camp in Verkhnyouralsk in the Urals. Mikhail was arrested a few months later, in 1934, convicted of attempting to establish a Ukrainian bourgeois government, and sentenced to 10 years at the Solovyetsky labor camp. Evicted from the house on the Embankment, Rada and her grandmother moved to a furnished apartment in the outskirts of Moscow, where they were joined by Rada's aunt Olga, whose husband had been arrested 3 years earlier, and their son Volodya. Feoktista tried to teach me to respect and love my parents, recalls Rada, but at the same time she expected me to love and respect Soviet power. It was not an easy task, but somehow she managed it. Grandmother sincerely believed that Stalin did not know about the scale of the arrests. She thought that there were so many enemies of Soviet power that it was hard for the authorities to work out which ones were guilty. In our house, one often heard the expression, "You cannot make an omelette without breaking eggs." Between 1933 and June 1936, Tatiana wrote 136 letters to Feoktista and Rada, an average of 1 letter every week. This is one of the largest surviving collections of private letters from the Gulag. The early letters reflect Tatiana's political preoccupations. She asks for Marx's writings to be sent. She comments in detail on the latest political events. In June 1934, for example, Tatiana's letters were full of praise for the crew of the Chelyuskin, which had just completed a pioneering voyage across the Arctic Ocean from Leningrad to the Bering Straits. The journey had ended in disaster when the steamship was crushed by ice and sank beneath the Chukchi Sea in February 1934. But the crew, which camped on an iceberg, were finally rescued by Soviet planes and flown back to Moscow, where propaganda turned their story into one of heroic survival. The Chelyuskin crew had shown the world what Bolsheviks are, Tatiana wrote on the 24th of June, adding 4 days later, on the same subject, "Pride in being a Soviet citizen was probably never as all-embracing and intense as it is today. Pride in the good qualities of the Soviet people, in the fine Soviet aeroplanes, in the good Soviet scientists and sailors and all the rest. Pride in Bolshevism, which showed the supreme power of its ideas and organization on those icebergs. And what power that must have for the education of children. Rada's political education was a constant concern in these letters. Mamma was always writing about how communism should be built, recalls Rada. She wanted me to become an engineer and a writer, and her letters had an influence on me. Although I was brought up by my grandmother, I liked to think that through these letters I was being brought up by my mother too. Tatiana wanted Rada to grow up as a communist. She spilled a sea of ink on commentaries about her behavior at home, which she said she had read about in the newspapers, to avoid revealing Feoctista as her source. 12th of June, 1935. And how are our household duties going, my little monkey? In the newspapers they write that you do your household chores without much pleasure, and often forget what has to be done. But they also write other things. I read this telegram in Izvestia. Moscow, TASS. The shock worker and model student Rada, 11, today was asked to clean the dishes and the kitchen. The task was fulfilled very well. The dishes were cleaned and everything tidied. Rada surveyed the results of her labor with great satisfaction and told our correspondent that from now on she will fulfill all her chores to the same standards of excellence. The correspondent approved, of course, and so do I. Study, little monkey, cook, wash, clean as you are asked. The main thing is to do as you are asked. The longer Tatiana remained in prison, the more her letters were preoccupied by family relationships. Mikhail was not allowed to write to Moscow, but he was allowed to correspond with Tatiana, whose letters thus became the only means of information for Rada about her father and for Mikhail about his daughter. Reflecting on her mother's letters, Rada believes that they allowed Tatiana to maintain the family connections she needed to survive. They were full of optimism, Rada writes in her memoirs. She was always reminding us that time was passing and was always looking forward to the happy time when the family would be together once again. Many of Tatiana's prison letters come with little gifts, rag dolls, toy animals, and even clothes, which she had made for Rada in the prison camp. On her release from the Verkhnyouralsk prison in 1936, Tatiana was exiled to Uralsk and then to Alma-Ata. Feoctista spent 2 weeks with Tatiana in Uralsk in March 1936. These were precious weeks for Tatiana, who later wrote of a new intimacy she experienced with her mother when they sat together, my head resting on your shoulder, and talked about the past. Shortly after Feoctista's return to Moscow, Tatiana wrote, Mamusyenka, I came home, but this is not a home. You are not here. There is no home, written in English, no cozy warmth. In April, when Tatiana moved to Alma-Ata, she began to pin her hopes on the possibility of Rada coming to be with her. She invested all her energies in organizing the move. Her letters from this time were filled with hopes and excitement. As Rada writes, her stubborn strength and persistence were completely focused on the tasks of finding work and a little room where she could live with her daughter. The trip did not materialize. In June 1936, just as Rada was about to leave Moscow to join her mother in Alma-Ata, Tatiana was rearrested and sent to an unknown labor camp. We bought the train tickets to Alma-Ata, recalls Rada. We found some people to look after me on the journey, packed all my things and sent a telegram with details about my arrival. The answer came, the addressee does not live here. We returned the ticket. I stayed in Moscow and never saw my mother again. Tatiana was sent to Kolyma, one of the worst of Stalin's Gulag colonies. In November 1937, she was shot. Mikhail was executed in Karelia during the same month. His correspondence with his wife, a Trotskyist, was recorded in his NKVD file as sufficient proof of guilt to sentence him to death. Rada did not know about her parents' death. She tried not to think about them because she did not know if they were alive or not. But once she saw her mother in a dream. To start with, I was on the deck of a ship in the middle of the sea. In my hands I held 2 schoolbooks covered in glued-on brown paper. I opened one of them and recognized my mother's handwriting. The first sentence was very strange. "When you read these lines, I will already be at the bottom of the sea." I read a few more lines, which I can't recall. Then I became gripped with fear. There were enormous pipes with water gushing out. My fear increased, seizing hold of me, until I awoke. Rada believed the message of her dream, that her mother had been drowned, and began to think about her all the time. Later, when she heard tales from Kolyma survivors about a ship of prisoners that had gone down, she was even more convinced of her mother's fate. She continued to believe her dream for many years, and even after she received a death certificate from the authorities stating that her mother had been shot, Rada went on thinking that she had been drowned. Tatiana Poulos was not the only fervent socialist who felt the pull of family after imprisonment. Nikolai Kondratiev was born in 1892 to a peasant family in Kostroma province, 400 kilometers northeast of Moscow. He studied economics at St. Petersburg University, joined the Socialist Revolutionary Party, and played a leading role in formulating the agrarian reforms of 1917. In the 1920s, Kondratiev was a prominent economist advising the Soviet government. He was a firm supporter of the NEP, favouring the primacy of agriculture and the manufacturing of consumer goods over the development of heavy industry. It was at this time that he advanced his theory of long-term cycles in the capitalist economy, Kondratiev waves, which made him famous throughout the world. But with the overturning of the NEP, Kondratiev was removed from all his posts. In July 1930, he was arrested on charges of belonging to an illegal, and probably non-existent, peasant labor party. Stalin wrote to Molotov, "Kondratiev and a few other scoundrels must definitely be shot." But in fact, Kondratiev was sentenced to 8 years in the special isolation prison camp, housed in the 14th century Spaso-Yefimeyev monastery in Suzdal, where he was imprisoned from February 1932. Kondratiev's health deteriorated rapidly. He was in and out of the prison hospital with complaints of severe headaches, dizziness, and intermittent deafness, chronic rheumatism in the legs, diarrhea, vomiting, insomnia, and depression. By 1936, he was practically blind. Yet, Kondratiev carried on with his research and prepared 5 new books. He wrote over 100 letters to his wife, Yevgenia, nearly all of them with little notes attached for his daughter Yelena, Alyona, who was born in 1925. The pain of separation which Kondratiev felt is almost palpable in these letters. It is his daughter that he misses most. The situation was all the more poignant because Kondratiev was obviously such a loving father. He desperately wanted to play an active role in his daughter's upbringing, and the worst part of his suffering in jail was not being able to do this. "How terrible that she is growing up in my absence," he wrote to Yevgenia in March 1932. "This torments me more than anything." As a father, Nikolai poured all his love into his letters to Yelena. When she did not write to him, he reproached her for not loving him enough. Nikolai would constantly remind her of little incidents from their life together before his arrest. He drew pictures in his letters and told her stories about the wildlife around the monastery, birds that came to visit him, foxes he had seen. In many of his letters, Nikolai included pressed flowers or grasses from the meadows near the monastery. Above all, he focused his attention on his daughter's intellectual development. He set her riddles and puzzles. He recommended books for her to read, asking her to write with her impressions about them. He encouraged her to keep a diary, corrected the mistakes in her letters, and nagged her to write neatly and always try to do things well. On the bottom of many of his letters, a young child has written the word Papa. They were all Yelena had of him. She grew up to be a botanist, a professor of Moscow University. Perhaps her father's letters influenced her interest in botany. In 1935, Nikolai sent Yelena a fairy tale which he had written and illustrated to mark her name day. The Unusual Adventures of Shami tells the story of a kitten who goes in search of the ideal land where people, animals, and plants live in happiness and harmony. Shami sets off with his friend, the tomcat Vasya, who is very cowardly and reluctant to go. On the way, they encounter many animals who try to dissuade them from going on, promising them happiness if they give up the search. But Shami pushes ahead, attracting various animals, a goat, a donkey, a horse, and a hen, who all work hard and want a better life. But soon the travellers lose their way. They begin to argue among themselves. Some get eaten by a crocodile. Others are shot by hunters in the wood. On the 31st of August, 1938, Kondratiev wrote to his daughter, "My sweet, darling Alyonushka, probably your holidays are over now and you are back at school. How did you spend the summer? Did you get stronger, put on weight, get tanned? I very much want to know. And I would like very, very much to see you and kiss you many, many times. I still do not feel well. I am still ill. My sweet Alyonushka, I want you not to get sick this winter. I also want you to study hard as you did before. Read good books. Be a clever and a good little girl. Listen to your mother and never disappoint her. I would also be happy if you managed not to forget about me, your papa, altogether. Well, be healthy, be happy. I kiss you without end. Your papa." This was the last letter. Shortly afterwards, on the 17th of September, Nikolai was executed by a firing squad.